Kia ora koutou. What I'm going to do, what I want today to be about is questions from the leadership in this room. As Mike said at his introduction, and I really like the comment from Stephen Fry, leadership as a verb is about what we're all going to do. And what I'm hoping today's discussion can do is provoke some of the actions that we might take from today, from the conference, and think about how we might take that into the leadership roles that we have out in the business world and out in the government world. I've got 4 speakers, and I'm going to call them into the stage just because today we've been affected by two tangihanga, so we've got a couple of changes in people coming up onto the stage. Not my first speaker, so that's Malcolm Johns, Chief Executive of Genesis Energy, so if I can just call you up. And then we've got Joanna Silva, from Head of Sustainable Finance at Westpac, filling for Fontaine, which is much appreciated. And then I've got Carlos Rivals, from Chief Executive from BlueFloat, and hoping and looking for some international experience and observations from him. And then finally, and thank you very much, Lisa Danielle, from the Climate Change Chief Executive Board, kindly stepping in to replace James. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm wanting today to be, as I said, a little bit of a opportunity for the audience to ask questions. I do invite and remind everybody the app. If you open the plenary session 2, the Q&A comes at the bottom, and that will give me some questions to direct to people. But I would like to give all the panellists an opportunity to ask and answer a first question that I have. As Ngāti Whātua raised in their mihi, and thank you for it, collaboration is key to achieving net zero and working together. Could you each perhaps give me, and I am asking for the single most significant barrier that's inhibiting effective collaboration between government, business and other stakeholders that we're facing at the moment, and what could be done about it? And if I could start with you, Malcolm, and then just run through and across the stage, just that single thing that you think at the moment is confronting us.
I think consistency. We have chosen as a country to pursue market-based mechanisms for our transition to net zero, and the rational deployment of capital is the hallmark of a market-based transition. And so consistency of policy settings that support not only the attraction of capital but the landing of capital in that process is absolutely critical, and what we're not seeing is consistency at the moment in those settings.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou, ko Joanna Silva tokuinga, kei Westpac hau e mahi ana, tēnā koutou. The primary barrier inhibiting effective collaboration between government and business that we see is that pervasive tendency to prioritise action on climate when times are good, and yet stay quiet about it for fear of reprisal or deprioritise it during challenging times. There obviously have been big events that have sucked up attention, like the pandemic, supply chain crisis, attacks from the right globally, pullback from ESG in the US. But the drivers for sustainability to date haven't been politics. The risks that companies and businesses are facing are very real, they're financial and growing more serious. And climate change is affecting our ability to be confident about our future. So I think that challenge is to stop putting it to one side, keep it on the agenda. It's not banging the door as loudly as revenue numbers, and we tend to react to sort of short-term, more visible changes over long-term abstract ones. So I think short-termism is definitely the enemy on all sides here. And I read something recently, it's cheaper to mitigate and adapt than not to. The clean economy is not just an environmental movement, it's a market and technological shift. So it's now more profitable to do something about climate than continue to watch it happen.
Thank you, Joanna.
Kia ora, no karas matina ho, tēnā koutou katoa. I think, related with what has just been commented, probably the key cornerstone to ensure a proper collaboration is to have a clear vision, a clear goal about how New Zealand wants to leverage all its resources in the energy business. Whether the goal is to simply provide reliable and affordable power to households, or do we want to go beyond that and use the world-class resources to attract energy-intensive industries, or even go beyond that and transform Aotearoa into an export market of energy-intensive products? It's difficult to find the right way of collaborating without having a clear objective about where we want to go together. And that medium term, I don't want to call it long-term vision because it can be done in less than a generation. I think it's a key aspect to define how to work together. So looking forward to talking more about that today.
Thank you, Carlos.
Perhaps building on what Carlos said, actually thinking about one of the most significant barriers is actually that at times we are pursuing different objectives that may not align. So, thinking then about how do we come together, how do we drive innovation, grow value, and I think at times we can be in competition there. So, that can I think be a real barrier. So how do we, I think decisions, they're diverse across various actors. So how do we really come together, act in a more coordinated way across shared objectives, and being upfront when we don't share those to really understand what's sitting behind those different perspectives.
Thank you for that, Lisa. So I hear consistency, keeping a focus to, and I think, Carlos, it's a brilliant point, we don't have long-term left, it's medium-term goals, and keeping consistency to those, perhaps, and then sharing and working through what's motivating us and where we can overcome those. So I think that's three things that, from a challenge, there's a lot of synergy about how that obstacle is facing us, or how we're facing that obstacle at the moment. Lisa, just turning to you then, in practical terms, what direction would you give to business if they wanted to truly partner with government, and what does government need from business in return?
Yeah, so government is already partnering with business to really try and better understand and address the complex kind of dynamic trends that are impacting business, and to inform the development of new policy, including this year the second emissions reduction plan. I think part of what government really needs though is specificity, particularly around where the biggest opportunities lie. And I think it's really helpful when business can also take the lens and considering both what those opportunities are to accelerate decarbonisation, but also what in particular is getting in the way, what specifically are those barriers, and also thinking about New Zealand's wider interests in terms of economic and social imperatives. So I think really getting specific about what those barriers are. It's clear that the government is wanting to put the ETS and price as the centrepiece. So when looking at complementary policies, specifically what are the barriers that are inhibiting the ETS to do its job?
Thanks for that, Lisa. And I suppose, Malcolm, that then turning back to you, when you think about the consistency comment you were making, what does that ask from a government perspective? What challenge does that put in front of your mind, I suppose, in maintaining that and that consistency challenge?
Well, again, if you come back to the architecture that we've set up in New Zealand, the two areas that policy really land is in the ETS and the ERP. And what we're seeing across political cycles is a reweighting of those tools. And so when you're pursuing market-based solutions for energy transition and for decarbonising your economy, those settings need to be very long-term, because those investment decisions are very long-term. And my colleague Carlos here, getting his capital to land in New Zealand is the critical element of driving action into the transition. You can't do that if the policy framework is moving all over the place every 6 years or so. We learnt that in the 80s with fiscal policy, and we created structures that enabled fiscal policy to be stable long term. And I think in terms of climate policy, that's the challenge, is how do you create long-term stability so that you can use a market-based solution to drive that transition?
Yeah, thanks for that, Malcolm. And I suppose that then maybe to you, Carlos, thinking about that from an international setting, where are you seeing that working well? What can we take from others, internationally, that might address that issue of attracting private capital, giving you that certainty?
So what we have observed in Europe is that countries have a knowledge that energy trading systems have massive benefits, have delivered massive benefits for many years. But were essentially designed to optimize energy systems in which the supply was by and large already there, with some incremental needs, and to a large extent based on sources of power that had a lot of variable costs. When it comes to transition to a new type of generation base that has high upfront capital investment and low variable costs, the challenge is how to preserve market-based mechanisms while at the same time giving visibility on revenues that can attract that investment and make those rational investments that Malcolm was referring to, at the same time minimizing financing costs, and hence achieving lower cost of generation. And the most market-focused country in Europe, which is the UK, invented this concept of CFD, contract for difference, in which generators have, or investors in new generation capacity have a clear base of price, but still participate in the power system, in the power trading system. So you preserve the volumes in that system. If prices are too high, you contribute to the system as a generator. So recently what we'll have observed in New Zealand is generation companies in the business I'm in, for example, in offshore wind, contributing to the system. Where prices are low is the opposite. And that is a very much market-based mechanism, where it's competition, different players compete to provide the lowest CFD price. Recently, last week, we have seen the last round of CFD tender in the UK, very successfully attracting 5 gigawatts of new offshore wind capacity into the system, whereas at the same time providing that visibility that new investment requires.
Thanks for that, Carlos. I'm going to ask one from the floor, just because it's had lots of reactions, and I think it might also give Malcolm a chance just to respond in meaning. So Joelle made it really clear that we need to stop burning fossil fuels. And I think someone's citing here a comment that you made at the Chapter Zero breakfast just the other day about New Zealand doing enough in regard to climate action in the face of what we've seen from that audience. And I suppose I was at that breakfast. I think, to my mind, what I heard you talking about was perhaps the need for us as leaders to have some more optimism about where we're heading and driving, rather than not needing to take action, or not needing to do more. But I just wondered if you had a response to that question about, how do we perhaps create some of the step change that we need to see, and for you it will be in the energy market, when we are looking at a system that is perhaps reinforcing, maintaining that business as usual level of energy supply.
I think if I can recall the comments that I was making then, it was about the ETS in particular as a tool to drive behaviour change in the energy system. And what we saw last year was the interference in that market to the point where the price collapsed, and that was really driven by domestic political imperative, and that undermined enormous confidence in that market. And so the ETS, really, if you're trading in the ETS, you're trading government policy. So the ETS really can only have a 3-year time horizon now, because change of government policy can change the ETS fundamentally, and we've seen it swing the other way just recently. And so the ETS as a mechanism is helpful, but ultimately it's problematic in its current structure to drive genuine change. And so it really is up to businesses to have very clear energy transition policies that drive your business towards net zero by 2050, because that market mechanism is unreliable at the moment.
So do you think that drive in itself will be enough when we're playing on an international stage where incentive or support or investment support from governments is coming in other jurisdictions that doesn't create an even playing field for that kind of transition, that kind of change here? Are we doing enough in New Zealand to drive that step change?
Well, we've chosen the market pathway, so that relies on the rational deployment of capital. So the market settings have to support the rational deployment of capital. And, Carlos was mentioning the structure that's used in Europe. The challenge with a market-based system is if demand does not lead, supply will not follow. And what we're asking at the moment is to pursue a market-based approach, but we want supply to lead. That requires the irrational deployment of capital. And the way that countries in the world have overcome that is either through subsidies or market mechanisms that incentivise the irrational deployment of capital. And I think that's the fundamental challenge in the energy transition, is we've chosen the market-based model. We have to ensure the settings are there and enduring to encourage the rational deployment of capital. Without that, supply will not lead demand. And it won't ever, in a market-based scenario, it won't ever lead demand by a long way.
And maybe, Joe, just turning to you, looking at that effective leadership and thinking about finance in particular, because without finance, this sort of step change, we will not be able to see it. What do you think effective leadership, one or two practical actions that you've seen to find strong leadership in climate action, perhaps to drive that step change, and what do you think has been effective or could be effective that leaders in this room can take away and think about?
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. I'm actually looking and listening to that right now, but I'll come back to you in a moment. I think it comes down to the courage to put sustainability, specifically climate change, front and centre of your organisational strategy, and genuinely direct funding, integration and strategic prioritisation of climate change, right up to and including board. We often understand climate, or sort of, characterise climate change as a risk, and while we absolutely recognise the many risks associated with it, we also think it's important to frame it up as an opportunity, because then, and I'm going to steal the words of my CEO here, when we frame something up as an opportunity, we open our thinking to the art of the possible. And so, to us, a climate resilient business is an economically resilient business, and there are huge opportunities for partnership, collaboration, talent, capital access, market access, growth, and success in businesses that are resilient. So the view that we take at Westpac is that by harnessing climate finance, we can do things differently and better. So it sort of links back to my first point, that we need the courage to see through the cycles and see through this sort of current sustainability recession, and to organise strategy around the opportunities that climate change poses. And if I think about the Gen 35 strategy here that Genesis has, and he didn't put me up to this, he's probably mortified, but a couple of really interesting headings from the investor presentation that really resonated with us. Progression through the transition will move Genesis from strategic value to financial value through electrification, flexibility and renewables. And I love this particular quote: thriving in the long term means planning for net zero. And I'm just, because I've got the floor, I found a little whakatauki last night that I really loved about this. He rangata mata whaiti, he rangata mata whanui. A person with narrow vision has a restricted horizon. A person with wide vision has plentiful opportunities.
Thanks so much, Joe. I have got a couple of questions from the floor, and I'm going to try and put those to the panellists in a way that builds maybe on some of the conversation that we've been having. How would you respond, and maybe I'll start with you, Carlos, just to and it's a little bit of a cold call for you, but the previous session from Joelle suggested that government's net-based approach is essentially greenwashing. Now, I know in Australia we have a much bigger drive to offsetting than we do here. So with that in mind, as leading organisations, how do we, from your perspective, drive that sort of step change that we need to see in something like the energy sector that moves beyond perhaps essentially trading what we're doing now to drive for the transformation that we need to see across and outside just the electricity energy sector, but into the replacement of fuel for the transport sector, for example. How do you see that balancing equation essentially as a trading off between that and greenwashing and that challenge there for that sort of transformation?
So beyond the moral obligation that we have to save the planet, I think what experience has been telling us is that there's also a massive opportunity in this transition. We've been talking a lot about plans from existing businesses to embrace the opportunities and also the challenges related with climate change. But when you look at the global scale, what we are seeing is a complete transformation. This is a revolution that is going on across not just the power industry, but across very different industries. When you see the level of investment that is going into artificial intelligence and data centers, for example, I was last week in Australia. There's a plan to invest just from one company, 70 billion Aussie dollars in the next 10 years in data centers in one country. It's just massive. But these global businesses are today deciding where to put those investments. And it comes to understanding what are the conditions that will be there available to sustain those businesses. So in the other particular case, they're looking for full green supply, not just net zero, but green every single minute of the day. If they don't find this in a country, they will not do it. Just to give an example, Singapore, which is a big hub for data centers, is planning a massive infrastructure to connect to Australia to supply its data center business with green power. That's in a different area, that would be completely absurd. Today, it's realistic because it's needed. So it's all about having a discussion also with the authorities. That's where the partnership comes into play, about what's the art of the possible, what can happen, what is that vision beyond our boundaries that could happen, and if we believe these are reasonable goals, because they are, how we work together to put that in place. So it's really about seeing the opportunity here and about moving together to put it to turn that opportunity into reality.
One of the things I'd observe, and we operate both in New Zealand and Australia for our business in the main and in Asia, but really would observe that, and I think Joelle made the comment about where Australia has come in to the climate change conversation as a relatively recent conversation, but they have turned that very quickly, I see, to an optimism about what does it mean for our economy, what are the opportunities that we can make in responding to climate change and turning that positive story around. I feel in New Zealand a bit we focus on the regulatory settings to enable, but rather than the incentive side of the equation, or how we might drive and incentivise that step change. Malcolm, you've talked a little bit about that in terms of those settings. What do you think is something that we could, what's one thing we could really do to incentivise that shift using those market mechanisms so that we're driving more perhaps towards that goal conversation that Carlos raised at the beginning?
If you compare Australia and New Zealand has 20 years head start on Australia in terms of renewable energy. If net zero 2050 is our ambition, then our ambition is to just achieve a hygiene factor. If going beyond net zero and turning renewable energy into an economic development platform for New Zealand, that's the ambition that really shifts the dial. And it meets a couple of objectives. One is it drives you to net zero and well past it, and I just want to come back to net versus gross in a minute. But the second is nobody's giving up their lifestyles. There's no evidence anywhere in the world that anyone's prepared to give up their lifestyle. So if we don't create economic opportunity out of the transition, then the population is not going to buy into it. And if the population doesn't buy into it, you won't get political ambition to lead the transition. And so to me, it's critical to go beyond net zero 2050 in New Zealand because the opportunity exists to do that. But the ambition is not there at the moment. The ambition is to get to net zero by 2050 rather than blow our way well past it and turn this into a new economic development platform. And electrons, green electrons and protein are the two economic platforms, in my opinion, for the next 25 years in New Zealand. Just coming back to net versus gross, I don't think we should get hung up on net versus gross, but if you do go net, there has to be a gold standard for what an offset is. And the offset needs to be permanent and verifiably permanent. And I think that's the critical element of net versus gross. My hunch is, from some other work that I was involved in the APEC trade stuff, is the world will go net. But without a gold standard globally of what net means, that's where the risk from a trade and an economic perspective will come into that debate. And so gross is safe because if you choose gross as your pathway and you drive it to where you need to, then net doesn't matter. But my hunch is the world will go net. And I just think that the critical element of that is that gold, what is the gold standard of offset?
So if we were to move to gross, or if we were to move to that optimism and basing an economy, what is, from a business sense or from a government sense, what's something that we could be, that this room could take away to champion, and that we could take away to champion about driving some of that? Because I think, to me, it really, it moves the dial from this being a concern-based energy to an optimism, as you say, based energy, which people lean into. People are encouraged to lean into positive action. So how can we help from the public sector, the private sector? And I'll ask along the line, and perhaps start with you, Lisa.
Yeah, well, I think starting with what are the frameworks we're working to in New Zealand, and accepting some of what Malcolm said, but actually we do have that long-term legislated target locked in. We do then have the series of emissions budgets that are articulated through what the Climate Change Response Act and the Zero Carbon Amendment Act in 2019 required. So I do actually think that we have some good frameworks in place from the perspective of that legislation, and then from that, your emissions reduction plans, which obviously, that policy set can adjust through time, and I think this government is interested to engage and understand when it comes to the emissions trading scheme, what aspects are there remaining barriers that actually that scheme is not necessarily going to drive in and of itself. But I think the key thing there being that we do actually have those long-term targets and the stepping stones that have been established, and that both, that was passed with bipartisan support, and those budgets still in place.
So, fully agree, and to get there, I think the key word for me is innovation. And innovation both on the private and the public domain. I lead an offshore wind business, a global offshore wind business. Offshore wind is innovative almost by definition. It's a new business that is growing. We see new technologies coming into commercial almost every day, but innovation is also required on the administration. It could look scary because innovation seems to be kind of a breakthrough with the past, and it shouldn't be. It can be consistent with the existing policies, with the existing frameworks, and as I was commenting before, keeping a very strong market focus has been the case in the country for many years. You can still build in new ways of attracting rational investments by developing new ways of providing that long-term visibility, again, while keeping market-based mechanisms. So it's really about building innovative things. It's very difficult to change the future if we keep doing things as we have been doing them for many years. Something needs to change, but we need to embrace that change, and we can build it together between the public and the private sectors.
I've got a few thoughts here, so bear with me. I think on the Australian one, and sorry for all the notes, but the joy being a last-minute ring-in. If you think about Australia and the massive turnaround that Australia's had on climate, it went from being quite climate denying in a few years to now really throwing the full weight of its economy behind the transition. And this will uncover huge opportunities. I was looking a couple of weeks ago at a company, I might pronounce this wrong, UBCO. It's a Tauranga-based electric motorcycle manufacturer. They've just bought Australia Post has just bought 175 of the startup spikes for a pilot that could lead to a wider rollout for 10,000 of its posties. So I have to think, how long will that startup be based in Tauranga if the demand's not here? We've always talked about living lockstep with Australia on climate action, but we're likely to fall quite behind. They're talking about generating 400 gigawatts of renewable electricity in one solar farm. So I do think that we have to think a lot bigger here about this opportunity. On the gross net, we had some internal discussions on this point when we're looking at our ERP2 submission. And I'd actually really like to acknowledge Kate Gunthorpe for her leadership and challenge on this discussion internally. We have to keep the foot on gross emission reductions pedal and the opportunities that flow from that. If we take our foot off that pedal, that threatens our target, that threatens our market access, and it will result, or you could say is resulting, in lost opportunities. So, how can we respond to the gross emission reduction challenges like a nation that will have challenges accessing global markets for capital, talent and export. And these markets are moving faster than we are. We have to have a credible plan, otherwise we will lose, and in fact are losing, market access.
Thanks, Jo. Do you have any further comment to that? And Jo, maybe picking up on that, in that innovation story, do you have any sort of practical thoughts or practical examples of things that we can do to try and ensure or to encourage that investment to stay here? Because as you say, we can see opportunity offshore, and how do we keep those sort of opportunities here? Maybe from a finance perspective, if there's any observations you have there.
Yeah, I think as well as the good inputs that we've heard this morning, I think having a chat to your bank, because certainly when I started working at a bank, I just didn't understand the depth of understanding that the finance sector is bringing to the climate financing challenge. Also, shout out to Toi Tutahu at the Centre for Sustainable Finance and how they're really coordinating and coalescing around the challenge of mobilising capital for climate. All of the major banks have a range of different sustainable business loans. What I love about ours is that they are uncapped and they traverse all the different customer segments. And if you're not sure what you need, come and have a chat to us. We've got an ESG advisory team, and their job is to help educate our bankers and to help our customers understand what the transition looks like. There's a genuine desire for us to help. I think too, if you step back and think about your organisational strategy is, where before most companies were looked at sort of that shareholder primacy point, it was all about shareholder return. We now know that the environment that we live in requires you to look beyond your shareholders and look at your directors, your regulators, your lenders, your staff, your consumers, your competitors, your customers, your supply chain. There's a much bigger set of voices in your organisational strategy and how you respond to those long-term systemic strategic challenges like climate. And so by bringing those voices into your room, giving your sustainability teams proper resourcing, giving them seat at the ET table, a voice in the boardroom, you can bring that stakeholder lens through into your strategy and unlock those opportunities. One of the ones that I'm most amazed at the moment, this is a bit technical and dry, but it is cool, is something called project finance. It's a structured finance solution that's used to pay for construction and operation of projects such as wind farms and solar farms. And it's long-term financing where rather than the debt being repaid by the entity, the borrower, it's repaid mainly based on cash flows from the wind farm or the solar farm. And we financed 350 megawatts of solar to date, which is about 70% of what's in the market. And there's just this massive stream coming through. That same team was building schools and roads 5 years ago. I'm not going to say we're not going to build schools and roads again, but there's just so much opportunity there to use innovative, smart structures that help deploy this sustainable infrastructure that we need without it all going on one entity's balance sheet or the government's balance sheet. So I'll pause there, but lots and lots of exciting collaboration and opportunity.
Thanks, Joe. And just moving then to a question from the floor, and I think you've probably given quite a good answer to it, but I'll give others the opportunity to do so as well. And I know that we have a number of you here on boards and all of you here in executive leadership roles. Thinking about boards and executive leadership roles, and probably more for private sector companies, but perhaps thinking about some of the government initiatives where we're bringing different government departments together for some of those drives. How can we influence them to take deep, urgent action on climate? And I think, Joe, you've covered some of those in your thoughts, but thoughts from the others on how we can do that in the board discussion, how we can elevate that conversation.
Look, from my personal perspective, I'm a really, really big proponent of creative destruction, and that is ultimately investing to disrupt yourself. And that's something that Genesis has a strong track record in. We have our colleagues from Ecotricity over here. We've invested in Ecotricity for some years. The purpose of their model was to disrupt our retail model. They're the largest retailer of rooftop solar and batteries in New Zealand, and we've continued to pour as much capital into their development as we have into our own development. And I think for boards and executives, you're torn between preserving the status quo and investing in yourself 2.0, and a really good way of doing that is through the creative destruction model, where you do invest ultimately in a competitor to drive that transition forward.
Thanks. It's an excellent example, and perhaps goes to your point, Joe, of it's really hard in tougher economic times to keep yourself open to that risk and that discomfort of that uncertainty. So it's an excellent example. Carlos or Lisa, anything to add from you in thought?
Yeah, just building on what Malcolm just said, boards' objective, or one of their main tasks, is to manage risk, to understand, measure, and manage risk. And if there's one risk that boards should be taking care of is not just climate change itself, but all the consequences it could have for their business. There's going to be a massive change across all the sectors, I would say. There's very few exceptions, if any, actually. So if your company or your board is not reading into that, is not analyzing which are the risks and how to address them, they're not doing their job. And as CEOs, we must be dedicating part of our time to understanding those risks. And the risk related with climate change and everything which is related with this, including energy, is super important. If you're part of a global supply chain, there is a risk that your clients will stop buying from you unless you demonstrate that you are moving into net zero. And that is not just something that is a dream that will happen somewhere in the future. One of the drivers for adoption of renewables, for example, in countries like Japan, is the industry in Japan is asking big voice, the government, you need to move on, because otherwise we'll be disconnected from the global supply chain. So these are just a few examples about how boards can anticipate big risks for the businesses. No?
Thank you. Lisa?
Yeah, great answers. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think from my private sector life, certainly found that like the creative disruption and what competitors might do to be hugely influential when you're asking the board to actually have a look at what that might mean for the organisation in a decade's time. I mean, the board that I serve spends all its time thinking about how we're going to be continuing to meet our emissions budget. So in that sense, I think continuing to be able to partner to better understand really what those business insights are and what might actually disrupt sectors for New Zealand, and how we can ensure that we're making the most of the opportunities that are presented, and understanding then what innovative policy development might look like too.
Thanks. And maybe then starting with you this time, Lisa, because I think this will be a question that's come from the floor that will be really pertinent to exactly that consideration, but I think also goes to a comment, Malcolm, you were making about our communities as both buyers of the products that we're putting out. What are the panel's thoughts on how we can mobilise our communities to both take individual action but also demand from business and political leaders the urgent action that we need? So how do we reflect that consideration of the community voice in that thinking, but also, I suppose some of that is joining the dots to the community condition and economic circumstances that they're facing at the moment, and how we can work through or see through this transition for current economic challenges that we're seeing in those communities. Do you have any thoughts on that from your perspective, Lisa?
I mean, I think probably the business folks might have good examples in terms of, always having your finger on the pulse and actually understanding who your masters are, and they are the consumers, New Zealand consumers, investors and others. I think probably the most pertinent example that I can think of when it comes to community voices and really understanding is actually on the adaptation side. So for New Zealand, in terms of its adaptation response, that needing to be so kind of unique to different circumstances for different communities, and so the government, policymakers, councils, being really attuned to what those community leaders, those councils, tangata whenua are actually going to need to be able to respond to climate change is one of the critical considerations, and is something that is certainly ongoing.
This is when I need Fontaine here, who should be sitting in the seat, because she would handle this beautifully. Yes. I will try and emulate what I think some of her thoughts would be. One of those would be ensuring Māori and iwi are true partners in the korero, give them a proper voice and seat at the table. It's incumbent on the public and private sector to ensure that seat at the table is real. One of my colleagues shared with me something that New Zealand Post does, which is that they have an empty seat at all of their board meetings representing future generations and those who cannot be present, which I think is quite beautiful. In addition to engaging with Māori and iwi, increasing representation across your workforce so the values and insights of all of your stakeholders are considered, a genuine intent to respect. You can tell I crowdsourced this answer. A genuine intent to respect, integrate and learn from the range of Māori, rangatahi, community, lender, regulator and wider stakeholder views will help determine whether we navigate this transition. But it's not just hearing from them, it's actually listening and then acting. I think the temptation is to treat ESG as an externality, particularly when we hear some of the messages coming across from the US, as I said earlier, some of the far-right messaging, and when times are challenging. But the voices are all out here. They post on our Facebook corporate page, they protest in the streets, they respond to customer surveys, and they buy our products or they don't.
I'll step outside New Zealand. I had the opportunity to chair the Climate Change Working Group for Trade Policy for the APEC Business Council. And on that working group, we had representatives from all 21 economies around the APEC region. And the thing that really struck me when I chaired my first meeting was only 3 other countries in the Asia Pacific region saw climate change the same way New Zealand does. All of the rest of them saw it completely differently. Some saw it as an economic opportunity, some saw it as purely a freshwater issue, some saw it as a survivability issue, some saw it through an inequality lens, but very few saw it through New Zealand's lens or through New Zealand's perspective. And that was a real wake-up call for me, that actually the way that we are viewing this challenge and the way that we're going about it does have a uniqueness in terms of the world as a whole. And so the important thing when we look at our communities inside New Zealand and how we approach things, we also need to remember that we're part of a global community that doesn't necessarily see it the same way as us and isn't approaching it the same way as us. That might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing, I'm not judging that, I'm just simply saying that we're part of a community and we're in a minority in that community.
So is that a value proposition for us or a challenge or both, do you think, Malcolm?
Look, I think it's like everything for New Zealand. We have to find our niche in the world and exploit it. And I genuinely think renewable energy is a platform that we can exploit, and there is a big enough niche in the world to do that. But I just reinforce that's a niche in the world, yeah.
Amelia, if I may, I wanted to share a couple of thoughts regarding the involvement of the local communities, because that's something that I believe is not provided sufficient attention. And from our experience in other markets, what we observe in some of the markets we operate, is that probably one of the biggest risks for the deployment of renewables and other low carbon technologies is the potential opposition for local communities. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is addressing a global challenge, ideally turning this into an opportunity to attract investment, but that investment will not necessarily go to the local communities who are going to make the effort of providing the land, the sea, the resources, potentially having to compromise on the traditional way of living for the benefit of the broader community or even the world. And that is not obvious how we can address that. So I fully agree that we need to engage those local communities early on, especially the communities that have been traditional owners of the space we are operating in. But talking about partnership, I think the collaboration between private and public is particularly relevant. There needs to be a signaling from the authorities about what is expected from developers like us. And this needs to go, in my opinion, into the structuring, the architecture of those mechanisms that we were talking about before, these innovative mechanisms. So when we're talking about providing feasibility licenses to develop offshore wind, in our case, we are strong defendants of having the social license being part of the criteria to award those licenses. And even when it comes to more monetary mechanisms like CFD, what we are observing in Europe and also in Victoria for the first CFD tender in Australia is that non-price criteria are becoming more and more relevant. Somewhere between 20 and 45% of the criteria is non-price. So there needs to be a majority still based on price. We still need a rational allocation of capital. But if there's a price to pay, it needs to go to the communities. Because without their support, this will not happen. And we are seeing it over and over again, and that a concern is in the rise, at least in the most advanced countries like the UK, France, or Germany. So in terms of penetration of renewables. So it's something to take very seriously, and we never can do too much in that regard.
I sat here a year ago, I think we were at the end as the moderator panel, and we had quite different array of panellists, and in particular reflecting youth and the younger future community voice, I suppose. No disrespect to any of you, I just, by title, we have a different panel here. It has made me think every day, are we pushing hard enough? Are we asking enough of each other, of the businesses that we're working in, the partnerships that we're working with, and the government that we're demanding support from in terms of driving things? So I'm going to finish with a question, and I did warn people that I was going to ask it, and I got a little bit of a lukewarm response. But this is a bit like speed dating. We've been trying to explore what government and private sector can do together, or what they can rely on in each other for. What perhaps is the question front of mind from each of you that you would ask of each other that might drive us living on that promise that future generations are asking us to act more, to act faster, and to be bolder? So what do we think we should be asking of government or of other businesses that we're not doing now, or that we could push harder on? I'm going to start with you, Malcolm, because you're usually good for a provocation.
I think it's a simple question. Are we being good ancestors?
And how do we ask ourselves, or how do we demand that of each other more?
Well, if you take the New Zealand Post example of having that empty chair there, you know, who, if you're in a senior leadership position, who are the youth voices that are advising you? Because ultimately, the test of being a good ancestor should be marked long after you've gone. And you know, I'm a firm believer that if you want to leave your footprints in that kōrero, you have to firmly put your fingerprints on the future, and you have to drive that future in a direction that when that exam is marked by future generations, you can genuinely say, I did everything I could.
Easier to say, I think, than live?
It depends. I mean, you know, if I think about Mike's speech at the start and Ngāti Whātua and their comments, you know, 80% of leadership is how you lead yourself. And how you lead yourself is about sweeping your own front yard first. And that's your test of whether you're acting as a good ancestor or not. I decided in 2018 that I wanted to, Genesis was one of the companies I wanted to be involved in because it's so pivotal to New Zealand's energy transition. And so for me, to be a good ancestor, how I spend my executive career years is really important to me. That's why I went to Genesis, because I want to go to where the challenge is. I don't want to go to where the challenge is already solved. And so, you know, that's the personal test for me. That's how I hold myself to account on being a good ancestor. You know, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren will mark that. I doubt I'll measure up, let alone the fact that I've probably worn the wrong colour combination today or something like that. But you know, all I can do is the best that I think I can do with my skills and my time right now.
Kia ora, thank you. Joe.
Thank you. Those beautiful thoughts. Malcolm, we've talked about, you know, I've mentioned the pedal on the transition point. I think what frustrates me, and this goes back to something Malcolm said at the very beginning, is that we're letting kind of policy and politics dictate our transition. And if I sort of step back a little bit and think, you know, Margaret Thatcher drove the UK's climate change ambition. You know, we had a Christian conservative leader in Germany that championed climate action there. It isn't a political issue most other places, but we've made it one. And I love the point that you made, Malcolm, and I'd like to remind those in the audience who didn't hear it or may have forgotten it, that in the absence of stable climate policy from government, send your demand signals to those in the sector who can enable the transition. Demonstrate your appetite to transition, demonstrate your appetite to invest in the transition, and tell the energy sector, the agri sector, the customers in the supply chain what you need. That will create the demand. You know, that the conversation from government is the market will solve this. And I think what's meant there is the ETS, the emissions trading scheme, but also the broader market. So send those signals almost despite government policy. So I think my kind of final take would be, don't let the politics, whichever colour they are, shape and drive your transition. Let your stakeholders and your need to be a good ancestor and your understanding of the risk and the opportunities do that. And if you don't understand those risks and opportunities, have a chat to the 350 people in the room today, because that, you know, we're here to share.
Thanks, Joe. Carl?
So fully support those views. I think we need to ask ourselves what we can do as individuals, as corporations. But maybe I take a step further. I think governments, and definitely the New Zealand government, is listening. So based on those convictions, those learnings, we also need to be proactive in engaging with the authorities and try to guide how the country can leverage the huge opportunities which is available out there. Resources are there. There is talent. There is people. We have infrastructure. It needs to be upgraded, but we have infrastructure here in New Zealand, and there is money. So all the ingredients are there. We cannot tell the next generation we had all the ingredients and we didn't know how to prepare a good recipe. So we need to do it together, and we need to engage proactively in that dialogue with the authorities, in my view.
Kia ora, thank you, Carlos. Lisa.
To tautoko that, I think in terms of collaboration right now, continuing to have those conversations about what is hard, and as I said at the start, I think we would need a real sharp focus on what are the most cost-effective interventions, given the kind of economic situation we find ourselves in. So noting that the ETS is the centrepiece, like what actually are those practices that need to change, what are the specifics that need to change to really remove those barriers, enable those incentives, enable new innovation, new technology for New Zealand.
Excellent. I'd like to thank the panel. I know we've got a lot of complex issues, but hopefully we've got some perspective in terms of the leadership in the energy sector and in the finance sector, and the role and relationship between the private sector and government. So thank you, and I'd like to just acknowledge, I suppose, the ongoing discomfort that we all need to embrace to drive this forward. Kia ora.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.